All right, time for chapter 2 of Wayside School is Falling Down by Sachar. This chapter is called Mark Miller. Mark is a new kid to the class, and Mrs. Jules, in her Mrs. Jules way, gets a little confused about Mark's name, and then, as they say, and then hijinks ensues. So, chapter 2, Mark Miller. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell. "I would like you to meet Mark Miller," she said. "He and his family just moved here all the way from Macedonia." Everybody stared at the new kid. He stood at the front of the room. His knees were shaking. He hated having to stand at the front of the class. It was as if Mrs. Jules brought him in for show and tell. He felt like some kind of weirdo. He just wanted to sit at a desk and be like everybody else. But worst of all, his name wasn't Mark Miller. He was Benjamin Nushmott, and he had moved from Hempleton, not Macedonia. But he was too scared to mention it to Mrs. Jules. He was afraid to correct the teacher. "Why don't you tell the class a little bit about yourself, Mark?" suggested Mrs. Jules. Benjamin didn't know what to say. He wished he really was Mark Miller. Mark Miller wouldn't be scared, he thought. He'd probably have lots to say. Everyone would like him. Nobody would think Mark Miller was weird. "Well, I guess we'd better find you a place to sit," said Mrs. Jules. She put him in the empty desk between Todd and Beebe. "Hi, Mark," said Todd. "I'm Todd. You'll like Mrs. Jules. She's the nicest teacher in the school." "Todd, no talking," said Mrs. Jules. "Go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline." "Hi, Mark," said Beebe. "I'm Beebe Gunn." "Hi," Benjamin said quietly. He decided he'd have to tell Mrs. Jules his real name at recess. He cringed. He didn't know why, but for some reason he always had trouble saying his own name. "And what is your name, little boy?" an adult would ask him. "Benjamin Nushmott," he'd answer. "What?" "Benjamin Nushmott." "What?" "Benjamin Nushmott." "What?" "Benjamin Nushmott." "What?" "Benjamin Nushmott." "Oh, nice to meet you, Benjamin." He never knew what made a person suddenly understand. When the bell rang for recess, everyone charged out of the room. Benjamin slowly walked to Mrs. Jules' desk. Somehow he had to tell her. Mrs. Jules was sorting papers. "Oh, hello, Mark," she said. "How are you enjoying class so far?" "Fine," said Benjamin. "Good, I'm glad to hear that," said Mrs. Jules. Benjamin shrugged. Then he walked out of the room. If I had told her my name, she would have thought I was weird for not telling her sooner, he realized. At the top of the steps, he looked down. Recess was only 10 minutes long. It didn't seem worth it to go all the way down, then come all the way back up. He didn't have any friends down there anyway. He had never been more unhappy in his whole life. He sat on the top step. "Mark Miller," he said out loud. That was an easy name to say. Mark Miller probably would have lots of friends by now, he thought. Suddenly he heard a low rumble. Then the stairs began to shake. It felt like an earthquake. The whole stupid school's going to fall over, he thought. He put his head between his knees. The rumbling got worse. "I'm going to die, and no one will even know who I am," he worried. "The new kid, Mark Miller, the weirdo." But it wasn't an earthquake. It was just the kids running back up the stairs. "Hey, Mark, why are you sitting that way?" asked Dee Dee. "You look funny," said Ron. Benjamin looked up. "How come you weren't at recess?" asked Jason. "We looked for you everywhere." "Couldn't you find the playground?" asked Calvin. "It's just straight down," said Beebe. "You can't miss it." "But don't go in the basement," warned Sherry. "Whatever you do, don't go in the basement." "We'll go down together at lunch," said Todd. "That way you won't get lost." Benjamin smiled. He was glad everybody seemed to like him. Or at least they liked Mark Miller. He wondered if they'd like Benjamin Nushmott too. "The bell has rung," said Mrs. Jules, standing in the doorway. "Now, everyone get inside." She made Todd put a check next to his name on the board for being late. Mrs. Jules handed out a stack of worksheets to Damien and asked him to pass them out to the rest of the class. Benjamin looked at his worksheet. At the top right corner, there was a place to put his name. He didn't know what name to put there, Mark Miller or Benjamin Nushmut. He left it blank and started working on the first problem. Louis, the yard teacher, entered the room carrying a white paper sack. This is going to come in much later in the book that Louis brings in this lunch. Louis, the yard teacher, entered the room carrying a white paper sack. Benjamin forgot his lunch, he said. His mother brought it. Who? Asked Mrs. Jules. Benjamin, said Louis. There is no Benjamin in my class, said Mrs. Jules. Are you sure, said Louis? It looks like a good lunch. I know the names of the children in my class, said Mrs. Jules indignantly. Well, I'll just leave it here until I figure this out, said Louis. He left the lunch on Mrs. Jules' desk and walked out of the room. Benjamin frowned. He looked at the white paper sack on Mrs. Jules' desk. He couldn't tell Mrs. Jules' real name now. She'd think he was making it up just to get a free lunch. He wrote Mark Miller at the top of his worksheet. But one of these days he knew he'd have to tell her his real name. And that's the end of chapter 10. And this chapter carries on a long way through the book about Mark and his name and stuff. It actually carries into one of my favorite chapters later on. So we're going to stop there. Chapter 3, BB's baby brother comes up. We'll get to him next. So here's a thought. Since you have some time, why don't you take this moment and do a 5-finger retell? You could do it with your brother and sister. They won't mind. Or your mom or your dad or grandma or whoever is there at the house with you. So 5 fingers, main idea. First, next, then, last. Okay? Good practice to keep in. We've been apart a long time, and I don't want you to lose those things that we learned about. So, again, when we do finish up a chapter, why not do a 5-finger retell with somebody? Heck, if nobody's there, nobody wants to listen to this silly story we're reading, do it in the mirror and tell yourself. You'll be impressed. You'll think that's the smartest person I've ever seen. All right, have a great day. I miss you guys. Bye.